Oranges and Lemons, a short story by Richard Holliday, read by Elliot Stammers, and produced by Jamie Ramaswamy, featuring music by Mark Morgan. This is a Jamie Rama Productions presentation, January 2013. Storm clouds are gathering fast, eh, hun? Of course, Brian was right. The sky was filling with restless black clouds, and soon they would deluge the entirety of their wet contents onto the squashy, moist soil that the farm found itself in. Scott Whitney couldn't complain, really. A good rainfall was always good for his farm. Water was the root of all life, especially the lives of his acres upon acres of green cotton plants, just on the cusp of shooting up through the soil that gloomy January day after the long winter. It had been merciless, yes, but it was over. "I'll be in a sec, Bri," Scott called to his wife, who stood on the decking at the rear of the house that seemed orphaned in a sea of plants and furrowed fields. The stripes of the ploughed ruts crisscrossed across all 15 acres. "Just taking one more look." A cold wind swept up, and Scott took this as his hint to seek the warm confines of his house, his wife, and his son. They'd always give him comfort and warmth, even if the house couldn't, and it was a definite possibility. It had been a long winter and an even longer autumn. The farm had been through some strife in 3 generations, but right now it was so hard. But the winter again had been endured, and the naive would think that 1985 would be the year that everything changed. Scott wished he could be one of those naive fools, but glancing upstream, he took a hard, long swallow. Great machinations were almost at their climax, and the great metallic monster upstream of a new chemical plant right next door did nothing but fuel Scott's apprehension. But there would be time for that later. For now, Scott's tired belly was also hungry, and it was a hunger he didn't feel like prolonging just to stare downstream at a mass of pipes. Nothing bad would come of it, Scott thought to himself, reiterating what he'd been told countless times before this whole thing started. But that was 1983. 2 years had flown by so quickly and so harshly, he couldn't bear to think about it. Again, food was the answer here, and with heavy, mud-caked boots, Scott Whitney finally succumbed to his ravenous appetite and headed inside. The kitchen area, just inside the rear door of the house, was messy and cluttered. The Whitneys had little time to be house-proud. This was a working farmhouse, and both farmer and wife were too busy keeping things on an ahead course to worry about trivial matters such as tidying. At any rate, Scott Whitney rather liked the clutter. It made his house a real home, lived in and full of life. Standing by the worn wooden table at one end of the room was his wife, busy scooping ladles of thick winter stew onto plates and placing them onto the table with satisfying clumps. Already seated was Scott and Brian's 11-year-old son, Elliot. Wide, intrepid eyes followed Scott to his seat at the table. "Hey, son," Scott began. "How you doing, champ?" "Great, Dad," Elliot eagerly responded. Good, Scott breathed, his exhaustion reaching crisis point. Brian was way ahead, and a steaming plate of the stew materialized before him. Scott took a fork to his food and ate. It was the first time he'd eaten all day. "I wish you'd not stare at the plant all day," Brian murmured. Scott looked up quizzically. "It's not healthy." Scott put his fork down. "I'm worried, Bri." "What for? You know what they told us. Cheap fertilizer for all, and that's just the start." Scott sighed apprehensively, but before he could speak further, Elliot chimed in. "Yeah, Dad, you can't solve the maze?" The maze? Scott wondered what the kid was on about. But of course, it resonated inside his skull. "Elliot," Scott chuckled insincerely. "Been down that arcade playing Pac-Man again? How many quarters today, son?" Elliot was impregnable, though, and his face took on a tone of complete seriousness. "The ghosts won't get you, Dad. You'll eat the big pills first. Cool blue filled the sky on a crisp morning early in March. For hours, many people had crowded on the fork of the thin, vein-like river where it diverged. And now, where grassland and marsh had originally been left undisturbed for years and years, there stood a great metal edifice that towered over the trees that surrounded it. Indeed, the brand new chemical plant, built flat out in a year amongst a hive of industrial activity, was a monster. But such a monster was never described as such. The marketing arm of Transition Corporation had gone to great lengths to portray this new alien addition as nothing but a positive influence on the community, and thus the entire community had turned out to see this great scheme come to fruition. However, Scott Whitney declined to venture up the 5 miles or so to actually be at the plant. The crowds had ruffled him, and he was far too busy working on getting his farm ready to take full advantage of the thawing spring weather and get back to greatness again. Every day he'd watched as towering catalytic converters, distillation towers and mechanical mashers had been assembled into an unearthly but somehow organic mass of pipes and machinations. Warily, he watched over the proceedings from his vantage point. He'd read all that Transition had said, but the proof of the pudding was in the eating. "We promised a few short years ago," said a tinny voice on the little TV set on the kitchen counter, "to bring this state into the 1980s. And now, midway through, we deliver on that promise, and more. We'll take this glorious land through the rest of the 80s, into the 90s, and well into the next century. Prosperity will be our time." Brian huffed at the pursuited man on the screen. Transition's CEO, Ashton Kleinman, his greasy hair and rimless spectacles, giving himself a well-earned pat on the back, wouldn't fold the laundry. But again, he continued, on a raised stage that was lined with bunting and ribbons that fluttered in the breeze. On a small wheeled trolley was a beige box with a monitor, a personal computer, and it was with a few ceremonial flicks of the clanky keyboard that the plant was officially brought to life. The applause of the crowd, every dignitary and who's who of the state, from governor to mayors and representatives of the country's leading-edge industries, reverberated flatly in the kitchen as Brienne went about what she did day to day, keeping the Whitney household going. "It's started," Scott called from the veranda at the rear of the farmhouse. Brienne walked out to see. Joining her husband in leaning on the worn wooden railing, she peered north. "What has?" "The future," Scott grunted, peering cautiously and deep down suspiciously at the great stacks and chimneys. The applause was not audible from this distance, but he didn't need to hear that to know that it was the start of something. A few wispy trails of smoke began to rise, clouding in the sky and trailing into the atmosphere from the plant's many little orifices and funnels. The transition had indeed begun. March 22nd, 1985. Finally, after the long winter and the even longer thaw that seemed to come after, Scott Whitney listened to the birdsong at dawn that morning with the first tinge of relief in his mind for a while. For 2 weeks now, the cotton seedlings seemed to have taken hold. The sprouts coming up from their rutted seedbeds were taking hold firmly, and looked to be the best crop for years. And, at first glance, Scott's notion of calamity toward the Transition Chemical Corporation's newly opened plant were totally unfounded. It was almost invisible, unless one looked straight for it. The smoke had died down and was manageable, and for the most part blew upstream away from the farm. And the fertilizer, sold at subsidy to the local community, was a godsend, and probably contributing to this year's prize crop. Heady dreams of the farmer saw his produce not just producing jeans and apparel for the local state and export, but maybe, just maybe, being the essential ingredient of a Savile Row suit. Finally, Scott prized himself out of his bed as the sun finally rose above the horizon, and its orange rays filtered through the net curtains and onto his eyelids. Time for sleep was over, and it was time to carry on work. But unlike before, He looked forward to overseeing his domain's resurgence, as opposed to many months of struggling to get anything positive down. Brienne, his wife, was already up, and nice enough to let her husband sleep a little longer. But Scott was thrown, as there were no sounds or smells of breakfast being prepared downstairs. Nothing, not even a mouse, could be heard. Finally, splashing his face with water and throwing on a plaid shirt and heavy trousers, his booted feet plodded downstairs. Brienne was there, at the kitchen window, a brush falling out of her distracted hand. Scott was instantly worried. "Bri, sweetie, what's up?" "Oh, God," she murmured to herself, and then turned her head slowly to face her husband. The look of despair and quiet horror on her face was one that Scott Whitney would now never forget. "Oh, God!" Scott rushed over to the kitchen window and shared his wife's shock. "God!" The entire field, every burgeoning green sapling and shoot, thriving the night before, was wilted and dead. Brown remnants now littered what was to be their salvation, and it was totally obliterated. Throwing open the rear porch door, Scott ran out into the midst of the field that engulfed the farmhouse. Every plant was dead, and reduced to a withered brown mass of rotted gunk. What could have done this so quickly? I don't believe it," Scott called out to himself. "It was all just fine yesterday." Brienne walked with a certain trepidation out to her husband. An odour, harsh and offensive, but not just of rotten plant matter, resonated in her sinuses. "Hun, can you smell it?" Scott took a whiff, and his nostrils detected what his wife already had. "Yeah, smells sulphury." His voice changed tone completely at the final word. Sulphury! Scott's head swung about to the north, and over the tree line at the end of the field marking the boundary. The transition plant loomed in the distance again. But before that, Scott Whitney noticed the standpipe in the middle of the field was dripping slowly into an old rusting bucket underneath it. It was full, and every drop rippled to the ragged iron sides and over the edges, onto the ground. His boots sloshed in the mud as he walked toward it. The ground sodden from an overnight rainfall, almost instantly the stench of sulphur and chemicals became overwhelming. And taking his nose to the bucket confirmed his fear. For final confirmation, he cupped a hand underneath the dripping faucet and let a few drops fall into his palm. They looked clear initially, but in a few moments there was a tingling, inflammatory sensation taking hold of the spots where the water had fallen. Instinctively, Scott Whitney flung the water from his hand into the pail of polluted water. In turn, he inspected all the standpipes, taps and faucets dotted around the farm, against wooden walls and brick barricades that sectioned off the yard. Each emitted, after squeaky turns, the same foul, contaminated water, and Scott's hand was red from inflammation. Inflammation from the water's acidity. Acidity that hadn't been there and shouldn't be there. Looking up, the sky had clouded over once again, and yellow flecks of water came down, and again the tingling sensation returned, but all over where the rain fell. Acid rain. Scott turned quickly on his heels to his wife, Brienne, who was still outside in the field, and Elliot too was there. He'd walked out to join his mother while Scott investigated the standpipe. "Get back in the house! It's acid rain!" Scott called, and his family ran inside, and only just in time. He took refuge under the roof. Inside the kitchen, Brienne quickly toweled down his hands and scalp. The acid was starting to sting. Nothing too strong, but not something desired on one's skin. Once it was dispersed in bowls of water, Scott looked over to Brienne at the sink. Outside, the rain was teeming down, and its acidic qualities reduced his prize crop to even more of a soggy mush. "The water's poison, Bri. I just know it," Scott said softly, quietly disguising his fury and disbelief. "Never happened before." "Transition was never here before," he spat back. Under the rolling tires, the ground cracked and crunched as the old truck roared toward the transition plant. So new it was that the gravel was still being compressed by the passage of road vehicles into its final place, and chippings were scattered far and wide in the sun, leaving a cloud of fine dust in their wake. The battered old pickup finally screeched to a clattering halt outside the gleaming glass edifice presented before it, past a plaque at the side of the road with a gleaming trident, the mascot of the Transition Chemical Corporation, and its ultra-futuristic lettering, until it was faced by the material manifestation of the power of money, of capitalization over humanity, almost. An edifice 7 stories high and coated with gleaming glass that refracted every ray of sunlight around like a prism, scattering it like God's gaze on the gravel path before it. And hiding behind it, almost, the great maze of machinery, pipes and chemical apparatus by which transition turned something into something else. A door on the ground floor, puncturing the great sea of glass, drew the attention of the dusty farmer, Scott Whitney. He walked slowly towards it. He pressed the suit and tie, but flecks of caked-in dirt and soot were evident. But he knew he had to make a good impression, and picked gingerly up from the passenger seat of his truck a cloudy plastic container, full of the contaminated water from the standpipes on his farm. Maybe material evidence would help where words maybe wouldn't. Scott took a deep breath and walked anxiously towards the door. An infrared sensor noticed his presence, and the doors shuffled apart and invited him into this alien territory. A breeze took hold, replacing the stale, warm air of outside. Air conditioning. And nothing but a beige ocean, marble floor tiles gleaming all around. To the far end, a reception desk whose facade was lined with glorious horizontal louvres that hid behind the Transition logo, and had the brims of 3 cathode ray tube monitors peeking over the parapet. Computers hummed and whirred, and the sound of important-looking people shuffling on the hard floors resonated all around. But this place was alien to Scott. Though this was the 80s after all, and after glancing around and taking a last breath for safekeeping, he walked towards the desk. The young pretty brunette behind, her hair tied up in a neat bun and blouse impeccably presented, a little ribbon tie the same colour as the logo neatly wrapped around her neck, looked up and down quizzically. What could this person, she thought, possibly be doing here? Expecting a vagrant who took a wrong turn, her manicured hand moved silently and stealthily towards the security call panel. Just in case, of course. But manners were manners, even if they were just a formality in this instance. "How may I help you today?" "I want to see someone who runs the plant. I think you're poisoning the water supply." The receptionist wheeled back and cleared her throat insincerely. "Sir, I for one can assure you that the Transition Corporation takes the natural world—" "Can it, Toots? Just call one of the bigwigs." For what seemed like an eternity, Scott waited awkwardly in the reception area. There were seats, but they were plasticky and deeply uncomfortable, and inside he wouldn't let himself get comfortable here. It was his firm belief that transition had poisoned the very substance that he relied upon to make a living, and he wouldn't allow any of their modern tendrils to lull him into a false sense of security. After 20 bitter, agonizing minutes, though, he'd had enough, and he walked back to the reception desk. The ditzy girl behind it sighed as he approached. "Look, sir, someone from management will be here momentarily." Scott's eyes narrowed with barely hidden frustration. "You said that before. Now, I'm a patient man, but I won't be made a fool of." His voice rose just a little to a fervent growl. "Get a guard down here now." The receptionist had had quite enough and reached for the security buzzer. "Sorry, sir," she said condescendingly, "but you will simply have to leave now." But before she could make the call to have Scott Whitney escorted from the building, one of the double doors leading off into the main administrative centre was flung open, and the quiet, awkward atmosphere was brushed aside by a freight train worth of noise and bubbling chatter. A tall, immaculately suited, bespectacled man strode forward, with a group of equally powerful-looking men behind. The lead executive was obviously showing off his plant to these people, and they were like puppy dogs, lapping up every word that oozed from his smug mouth. Next, gentlemen, we will be visiting the chemical bathing rigs and then the distillation towers, where we hope to make leaps and bounds in petrochemicals. And I hope you can keep up, because it's a constantly changing industry we're in, and want you to be in, too. Locking on, Scott bulldozed his way over. As he approached, the group scowled at him in his creased, dusty suit, and it was at the sight of the Transition Chemicals badge that the farmer knew he'd found the right person. A someone from upstairs, indeed. "Can I help?" "We're not hiring whatever it is you do, I can assure you." Scott shook off this pointed slur. "You can. Explain to me why your fucking plant is poisoning the land around here." The executive laughed nervously. His tour group's ears were peaked. I can assure you, sir," he began nervously. Looking over, he waved to the receptionist and silently mouthed for her to relocate his guests before turning his attention to Scott. "Maybe we should speak in a more private place." It wasn't a suggestion, and Scott found himself heaved by this executive into a side office off the reception area. He got a good look at the swinging name badge. Ashton Kleinman, one that was familiar. Then Scott Whitney realized he'd struck gold. Ashton Kleinman was the man from the TV, the plant's owner. "Look, Bob," Kleinman said instantly, "I don't know what you're playing at, but don't you dare come in here and make me look stupid in front of those investors." "That wasn't my aim, bub," Scott spat back sarcastically. "I just want answers. This plant is polluting the local water supply." "No, it isn't," Kleinman said stonily in a huff, his voice authoritarian and curt. "Disagree. Got proof here, son," Scott said as calmly as he could, thrusting his file into Kleinman's hand. "Some of the other farmers have noticed it, but I'm the closest. 5 miles away, getting the most of your acrid filth. Acid rain was just the start. Now the water is toxic." Kleinman palmed through the papers, which were a loose collection of statements and diagrams, all hand-drawn. Some were maps of the farms, pointing out water sources and standpipes in affected areas. A few Polaroid pictures of dirty buckets and burned plants were clipped on for good measure. But it was hardly, dare say, watertight. No scientific data? Just anecdotes and the scribblings of some inbred redneck country boy? "Don't think I'll be reading that," Kleinman said smugly, depositing the file in a trash can with a lazy flick of his wrist. Before Scott, whose face dropped, could say anything, Kleinman spoke again. "Don't bother coming back here, Mr... Oh, who am I kidding? I don't care what your name is. This is the future, farmer. You can do nothing to stop its progress. Now, get the hell out of my plant!" Kleinman pushed Scott back through the door he'd only just been thrust through less than 2 minutes ago. Kleinman clapped over to the receptionist once more. "Carrie Ann, have this vagrant escorted off the premises, and let the investors know I'm on my way in." She did so, finally getting to push that security call button she'd been trigger-happy with earlier. "Security to reception. We've a bum who needs an ass kicking out of here." A surly guard in a fresh-brimmed cap and crisp starched shirt emerged as Kleinman opened the door on the other side of the reception area. His face changed back to smooth businessman in an instant, and he began cackling with his moronic investors, laughing off what they had seen. They didn't remember anyway. They were too busy thinking on how much money they could make. But Scott saw no more of what was happening as he was forcibly thrown out of the main door and onto the gravel, white dust caking onto his battered jacket. And he looked up from the ground, livid. How dare they treat him like a bug and try to squash him? As he climbed back into his truck and rumbled away, he made a pledge that, like a cockroach, it would take more than even an atomic bomb to squash this bug. No, sir. This wasn't the last that Transition Chemical would see of him. They didn't realize it now, but an enemy had been made in Scott Whitney. The growl of the truck's engine got nearer and nearer, and Brian stopped what she was doing. Proceeding over to the front porch, she saw her husband climb out of the truck's cab once he'd killed the engine. While she'd been hopeful of some progress with a direct approach, one look at her husband's face, drooping and forlorn, told her that she'd have to rely on her much more realistic expectations. Deflatedly, their son Elliot ran down to the front door to see his dad return, but before he could cross outside, Brian stopped him. "Go back upstairs, Ellie," she calmly soothed. "Me and your pap need to have a talk." Elliot sensed the apprehension in her voice, no matter how hard Brian tried to conceal it. "Everything gonna be okay, then, Mom?" Brian smiled weakly. "Yeah, sure. I'll be up in a minute, sweetie." Elliot returned upstairs just as Scott Whitney walked into the cluttered, heaving sitting area inside the front door. Brian perched herself on the couch, and Scott instinctively took up a place in the armchair. "Come on then, Shug. Let's hear it," she said, initiating what would no doubt be a very awkward conversation. Scott lifted his head and wasn't upset. He was realistic and matter-of-fact about it. "They laughed at me. Kinda knew they would, truth be told." "Did they not look at your statements?" "Nah, they were in the trash before you could even recite the date. No real evidence, they said. All conjecture and anecdote." "Didn't you ask for someone more senior?" Brian ventured reticently. "Can't get no higher than Chief Executive Officer. Smart-ass townie. Treated me like some bit of crap off his $500 shoes. But I expected what I got, and I got what I expected from them." A brief, tense pause ensued. Both Scott and Brian were lost in thought, processing this new information. She spoke first, with a glimmer of hope in her voice. It was that had sealed the deal for Scott Whitney. Brian, the optimist, even in the face of untold adversity. She put up with so much so far anyway. "These tests, can you not get them done?" Scott relaxed his shoulders for a great breath. "Good, but it'd cost us. How much do we have?" Brianne's eyes rolled to the top of her head as she recalled the knowledge. "In the rainy day fund," she started, but her husband cut her off shortly. "Don't call it that. Jeez," he said painfully. "Bad analogy." "About $350 of loose savings and stuff, hon. How much are the tests gonna cost us?" Scott already knew the answer. He'd checked them out before, and it was for this reason they weren't included in his bundle of statements. $3,500. 10 times what we have." "Oh," was all Brian could muster. "And we've no real way of getting more. And," Scott said, his voice becoming morose and dejected as he carried on spilling his thoughts, "no real reason to believe that even if we did have the tests done, they'd get us anywhere." Another awkward pause, ended by Scott getting up and going to the back door. As he grabbed it, Brian leapt up and held his shoulder. "Where are you going?" "Out to think, Bri. Out to think." The screen door then was left rattling in the frame, and the truck started up the path once more. And again, Brian looked on as her husband drove away to fates unknown to her. In this part of the state, the marshlands and floodplains surrounding the Great Mississippi River and its tributaries that fed into the Great Gulf of Mexico were naturally conducive to agriculture and farming, and it was no surprise that farms clustered along the banks of the little stream to which the Whitney farm also shared a major water source. All of them had thrived in the past, and all promised to again in 1985. However, being in such close proximity to the transition plant, all would reap the rewards. There were few, and all would suffer the problems brought about, which were many. About 5 miles downstream from the Whitney farm was another agricultural plot. However, it didn't grow cotton like Scott Whitney's farm, which was an expensive luxury that, while hard to grow, was worth the effort. Tyler Beauford's farm grew great quantities of grain, which was a staple commodity always in demand. Sure, it was the least prestigious of crops, but what it lacked in prestige, it made up for in demand and ease of cultivation. But again, Beaufort had found his water tainted in the weeks after the transition plant opened, and it wasn't a problem going away. He'd spoken to Scott Whitney about this before, and was eager to see if his fellow farmer had made any headway. The mud sloshed the wheels of the truck that bore down the solitary winding path to the Beaufort place. Tyler would soon be in possession of his answer. "Got anything good, Scotty?" the older man called out as Whitney clambered out of his cab and looked around. It had rained recently, and the ground was fresh with rainwater, and the air here had the tinge of recent precipitation of it, and it was something Scott Whitney loved. Looking around again, Scott noticed that the big cylindrical grain silos were not as full as he'd expected them to be. Sure, harvest time was a while ago, but geez, he didn't expect the stocks to have been depleted that quickly. "No, Tyler, they left us off," Scott repeated what he'd told Brian, and he was as unhappy about it the second time. "No proof, no scientist reports, just a laugh and a kick up the ass," Beaufort hummed. "Shame, but I suppose we knew what we were getting into. Just those reports would be crippling to us both, I imagine." "Yeah," Scott hummed in agreement. Another awkward pause. "So then, what do you want to do?" "I can't get anything to get going to any serious extent, Scott. How about you? How you guys holding up?" "Not good. We're headed for trouble," Scott responded. True. By unlucky coincidence, his farm was closest to the transition plant, and duly received the lion's share of the contaminated water. It was more dilute and less potent by the time it reached the Beaufort place. Lucky son of a gun. "Look," Tyler yawned, "I've thought about this a bit. Come with me. I want to show you something." Scott was curious and skeptical, but followed the older farmer into one of the large barn buildings, and inside he saw 3 great wooden pallets loaded with sacks of fertilizer powder, all stamped proudly with the Transition Chemical Corporation's Trident logo. Scott surmised what Tyler Beaufort was proposing. "Sheesh, man. Must have cost you for all that fertilizer." "Well, yeah, but I've got a cousin who works at Transition. Let me have this lot for 1/3 of the list price. And, well, I can always get more. You're a good man, Scott, and us farmers have to help each other if no one else will help us." Tyler was right, of course. It's been like this for generations. No one from the city would help the farmers, so they either had to help themselves or face ruin. And Scott knew now that being proud didn't feed his son. "Cool, Ty. I'll take it." "Ah, nice. Let's load it into your truck, and hopefully it'll be a big help." As Scott went to fetch his pickup truck, he thought to himself, yeah, a big help, a favor he really must repay when the time was right. But another, dark thought crossed his mind, but he was so appalled by the sheer notion he dispelled it, put it into a deep corner of his mind, and focused on the task at hand. At least some good could be said to come out of today. At least. 3 months later. It hadn't worked. Despite Tyler Beaufort's kind gift of the fertilizer, nothing had worked against the decline Scott found his once great farm in. Every week, more pollutants in the river, now a foaming green morass of chemicals and reactants that bubbled down toward the Gulf, seeped into the very ground that Scott called his own. There was no more pretending that the transition plant was a force for good anymore, and there was no denying that it was scarring the very world it was a part of. But one morning, a bright June day, with no clouds in the sky, the crisp sunlight refracting off the polluted water down the end of the farm and shimmering ethereally, Scott Whitney dusted down his crumpled suit once more. He'd written letter after letter to radio stations, television studios, and the governor of the state himself, but again a few sympathetic replies were sent back, but nothing material. Almost as if there was a bigger force than one lone farmer stopping anyone with any real power or clout from doing anything to alleviate the situation. "Good luck, hon," Brian said softly as her husband crossed outside into the beautiful daylight. In any other circumstance, it would be a perfect day. But for a desperate farmer, his land corrupted and useless, and his tether fraying at the end, it was anything but. Another day to somehow get through. "I'm not sure how long I'll be, sweetie," Scott murmured back. I'll try to call." She smiled back, bolstering his resolve. "You'll be fine." "Yeah," Scott sighed, kneeling. "I hope so." He turned to Elliot, his son, and embraced him. "I'll see you soon, kiddo." "Sure, Dad. Blast him!" His son, the epitome of the innocence of youth, squeaked back, more resolve restored. "All right," Scott said, taking a few steps toward his truck. "Here goes." And off he drove, with his little family waving him off for good luck, as he'd no doubt need it. The parking lot outside the Capitol building was crowded with pristine, gleaming cars that the Whitney truck, caked in dust and mud, stood out next to like a sore thumb. Deep in the heart of the city, Scott Whitney felt uncomfortable. This was towny country, and somewhere that felt alien and uncomfortable. There were business-suited yuppies everywhere, it seemed, and almost instinctively, Scott brushed down his suit and loose tie to try and fit in a bit better. But who was he kidding? He'd never fit in here. It wasn't his place. Resolutely, like a man on a mission, he strode towards the great grey cement edifice that was the seat of government for the state. Under the imposing great tower, and in through the tall doors, taking another breath as another threshold was crossed. The interior of this great place was tall, but the dark wood panelling nonetheless made it feel cramped and claustrophobic. A stairwell on the far side led upwards, while crowds of people, no doubt on official business of some sort, milled around, crisscrossing the floor in droves. Scott Whitney walked over into the centre of the room, until he stood on the central point of the great state's seal emblazoned on the middle of the marble floor. Well worn, scuffed a little, but resplendent and authoritative. The reception desk was busy, but that didn't matter. Scott didn't have an appointment to see the governor. That was who he intended to see. Might as well go right to the top if he wasn't going to go anywhere, right? The great stairs swooshed up the curved walls of the building, and Scott followed them up, higher and higher, for what seemed like an eternity. It felt like climbing a mountain, but without any complaint from Scott, ascended 20 stories right to the top. People whizzed by in elevators, but that was of no consequence to the beleaguered farmer. This was just part of his fight against transition, and if he ended up getting a hernia climbing up all these steps, every concrete treat sending pins through his calves, then so be it. Worth it to get his farm back and give his family some kind of future. The governor's office soon beckoned right at the top of the building. A great double-wood door that faced the landing of the stairs and gave an imposing, better than you aura to anyone who knew they shouldn't be here. But it was deserted. The sounds of the busybodies downstairs muffled almost into song by the walls, carpets, and sheer volume of air from down there to up here. One of the doors into the governor's complex creaked loudly, revealing an intermediary area. A personal assistant's desk lay abandoned and unmanned, but not for long, presumably. There were papers still messily strewn on the desk, and the glowing personal computer terminal whirred with existence. But more voices, ones Scott Whitney didn't place downstairs, could be heard. These were much nearer, on the other side of a door on the opposite wall of this waiting room, past the door labelled Governor. Creeping up, Scott pressed his ear to the thick door. It rattled a little in its mountings, and he took a sharp intake of breath. Hopefully this didn't attract the attention of whoever was on the other side. It didn't. The sound of hearty, middle-aged men laughing bellowed, and would have easily drowned the rumbling rattle of the door for a split second. "Ah, Penrose," one voice chuckled, a voice Scott found oddly and ominously familiar. "Where do you get this fine drink? Did you let a distillery plant itself wherever it fancied as long as you were kept in liquor?" Another voice, beefy and authoritative, slurped and whinnied. Ashton, you know as well as any other greedy businessman, if you throw enough money or drink my way, you can do whatever you damn well like. Ashton? Oh, God, Scott thought, gasping in disbelief. This could only be Ashton Kleinman, Transition's CEO. He listened on, intently, not missing a word. I've had a few of the marsh flies complaining, though, saying Transition's poisoning the land, ruining their futures, usual rural crap, Ashton said smugly, sneering at those tiny moths that dared question him. Well, is it? The Governor Penrose Colton asked pointedly. Well, maybe, but don't worry, I'm sure we can come to an arrangement, one beneficial to both our causes, where any environmental report is, say, mysteriously lost. A latch clicked, and a second later, the Governor gasped again. Oh, Jesus! Kleinman snorted in agreement. I think we have a deal then, Governor. The two men then began laughing like sewers once more, but this was a repugnant sound. Scott couldn't listen to any more. It was just too painful. He was wasting his time. But then, as his mind faced certain defeat, he remembered the personal assistant's desk. Maybe, just maybe, he could find some way to incriminate these two. Scouting around for the sound of high heels on wood floor, Scott rifled through the desk before looking at the surface by the computer keyboard. A tape reel system. Connected to the assistant's intercom. Wires led off and into the desk and down the wall with the office. The tape had been left running too. Electrical impulses conveying a ton of immediate thoughts coursed like an instant through Scott's mind. Who was the previous owner of this office? Richard Nixon? Panting with excitement and disbelief, Scott rewound the tape for a few seconds and hit the play button with a clunk. I think we have a deal then, Governor. Kleinman's voice echoed, distorted by tape hiss, but no doubt unmistakable. Almost immediately, the tape found its way into Scott Whitney's pocket, and feeling elated, he headed back. But when he returned, triumphant at his discovery, the farm was empty, the front door left open. No one was home, and the house had an eerie, lifeless feel to it. Until he discovered the note on the kitchen draining board. I'm sorry. The note crumpled lightly in Scott's hand as he took in what it meant. Obviously some compulsion had driven his wife to flee. But fleeing from what? Just this morning there was a real hope, albeit a bit misplaced, that all this business could be settled and life would resume again. Even though this hadn't been achieved, something different had, and surely Brienne was strong enough, nay, their entire marriage was strong enough to see this through. Plodding up the stairs, the cold air of the house rustled through the tired farmer's hair and against his glistening, dewy eyeballs. Across the landing were two open doors, one for the marital bedroom, the closets left open and stripped, presumably from when the contents were bundled into cases and taken out in a hurry, and Elliot's bedroom. This hurt the most. His precious son. His world, really. Gone. And all real worldly trace of him, too, disappeared. The reason for their leaving, Scott knew not. Instead, he sat on the edge of his son's little bed. It was cold, and would never be warm again, he thought. And for the first time since this whole crisis unfolded in an instant, Scott Whitney cried. But the time for crying was transient. The trip downstairs was agonizing, and he felt a little delirious, but Scott came down with a determination, one to put things right. But somehow this was a fire extinguished by the harsh torrent of reality. Even if he could somehow bring transition to account, who'd believe him? Who didn't that smarmy bastard Kleinman have in his pocket to further his ends? And he didn't even know where his family was. No point putting everything right if there was no one to share the newly rediscovered prosperity with. And that defeated the entire purpose, surely. Why bother doing anything anymore, Scott thought to himself, if there's no one you love to share it with? As dusk fell, Scott lazily fell into the bath. It was cold and disappointing, but he didn't care. Looking across, he saw pills. a razor, the water itself. 101 ways to kill himself. To end this horrible mess now, lest it become truly unbearable as time wore on. Like it would do. The thought rapidly crossed his mind. But no, he wouldn't. Something in him told him that this was a fight, maybe worth giving one last shot at fighting. In a bath of sorrow and sadness, a rubber ducky of hope had surfaced from the suds. And not sensing any more, Scott decided to take the chance before it really was too late. The gravel path to the gleaming plant was showered in remnants of the loose stones as the battered pickup roared back toward the great administration block. Lazily careering in a semicircle, the truck stopped and Scott Whitney hopped out, partly exhausted and partly fuming, making straight for the glass door, kicking it open with such force that the glass pane shattered. This entry immediately provoked a hostile reaction from the same bitchy receptionist with which Scott had been acquainted on his previous visit. Wasting no time, Scott leapt towards the desk just as the taut brunette girl reached for the security call button. "Button it, toots!" he barked, leaning over and wrenching the little box from the desk, pulling it away with a firm tug. Plastic umbilical cords that tethered it to the desk resisted, but a further tug parted them and the box was discarded. "Sir, you can't!" she yelped and turned. "Help! There's a crazy guy here!" "Shut up and get me Kleinman!" Scott growled aggressively. "Get him, or I ram that box up your ass!" Shaking with fear, the receptionist made the call. Nervously, her voice faltered into the telephone system. Mr. Kleinman? Yeah, there's a visitor in the reception area. Urgently." The phone clattered back into its base, and a few impatient footsteps approached. The door to the main plant swung open, and Kleinman bustled out, obviously disgruntled at being interrupted by something so vague and unusual. "What the hell was it, Carrie-Anne?" he said, before looking to see Scott Whitney. His voice dropped. "Oh, you. Got a minute, Kleinman, you snake?" Scott spat loudly. "No." "Tough," Scott sneered. "What the hell have you done with my wife and son?" "I don't know what the hell you're talking about." Scott's chest puffed out. "I know my own wife. She'd never walk out. Not like she did. And my son? She'd never take him away from me like that. Not without even a sideways glance." "Maybe you don't know your wife as well as you think you do, Mr. Whitney," Kleinman curtly said, his voice slick and enragingly condescending. "I know my wife, you son of a bitch," Scott panted. Sure, cursing wouldn't really give him the moral high ground, but he didn't care. He was past caring now his wife had gone. Kleinman took a breath. "Maybe, then, she simply took advantage of our generous offer, shall we say?" He turned to Carrie-Anne, the receptionist. "Take your lunch, doll." Carrie-Anne left, but not wasting the opportunity to give this uncouth vagrant, as she saw Scott Whitney, a blast of ice eyes. But Scott's attention wasn't with the eye candy. Now they were alone. The two adversaries could finally get down to business. No more illusions and allegory. "What offer?" "There was a resettlement plan, and your wife had applied. Given our previous differences, I personally saw to it that her application was accepted." "Look," Kleinman said, producing a neatly folded document from his jacket. Official transition letterhead, some boilerplate text, and the agreement for resettlement, signed by Brian Whitney. But something was immediately amiss. "Not my wife's signature," Scott said proudly. Surely then the document was null and void. "Honestly, I don't care. I've gotten rid of you and your festering clan out of my way." Scott walked slowly toward the executive. He looked him square in the face before finally asking the question he needed to ask. For closure. Some kind of closure, maybe. "Why?" "Why what?" "Why are you doing this, Kleinman? Polluting the soil, the water? And you don't give a damn, do you?" A few tense seconds passed before Kleinman opened his mouth. "No, I don't. And because I can. Simple as." "You monster. It's business." No, Scott mouthed, trailing off in disbelief. Look, I'll level with you, Whitney. You want to see your wife and son again? Fine. There's a transition limo ready to take you to the new place. But if you step in that limo, you default ownership of your old farm to transition, and we bulldoze it. Give you $500 or so, and a couple of acres somewhere else to start over. I know about you and the governor. I'm not so easily bought. Choice is yours, Whitney. Kleinman breathed restlessly, his patience exhausted at last. I want my family back before 9 a.m. tomorrow, or a certain audio tape hits the papers, Whitney shrugged. Kleinman's face dropped. The intended outcome. Choice is yours, Kleinman. Resonating around the room in the dawn haze, a clock ticked slowly. 5 to 6 in the morning, and out of the deserted kitchen, a pink sun rose, dispelling the great purple and indigo sky of the night as it inched towards its rightful place at the top of the sky. A new day. The deciding day. The kitchen was deserted, but signs of life were evident. A loaf of bread and crumbs from whence it had been recently cut into a couple of great slabs and eaten messily over the floor, as there were crumbs there too. The lights were off, however. Across the muddy courtyard of the farm lay the workshop, whose doors were lazy and ajar, and the lights glowed softly, bathing the tired wood in a yellow light like the cracked yolk of an egg. All night, Scott Whitney had been preparing, pottering really, trying to think of something that could possibly persuade Transition to give him back his family. He didn't for one moment believe that Brienne had signed that relocation agreement under her own free will. He knew her better than that, and it was just not her. For 12 years they'd been married, just after high school really, but no, this wasn't her. A tingling, something in the back of his brain made his blood run cold at the sheer thought. This was Kleinman's doing. He was sure of it. Patting his pocket, he felt the cassette tape that would guarantee his adversary's downfall. Oh, the mess it would make. It was still there, safe and sound. The workshop was a mess, with barrels of old diesel fuel and pesticide that had become totally redundant recently. There was no crops to protect, and no tractor to fill with red diesel. It had been sold for scrap in the months between the opening of the transition plant and this current strife. The old girl hadn't gotten much, but it had kept food on the table for the struggling Whitneys. Not that there was anyone to feed now. The stale, cardboard-like bread that Scott had taken a bite of staved off hunger and collapse, but only barely. Sustenance was needed, but only the bare minimum could be expected to suffice for now. Thuds tapped on the leaky roof of the workshop. Rain. More poison to further render his land even more worthless. Could it get any more worthless? Do degrees of worthlessness even exist? This minor linguistic absurdity plagued Scott's mind for almost an hour as he lost himself in his own mind. And all the while the holes in the roof got a tiny bit bigger, and the rain came in, dripping down the walls and hissing as it took the old lead-based paint straight off. It was a potent, ruinous mixture. Why not end it all now? Why didn't Scott just jump into one of the numerous rusting vats of this filth that permeated the land? The thought of seeing his son culled those ideas stone dead. If he could get one more chance to see little Elliot before his end, he'd take it. There was about half a dozen burlap sacks in the corner, and Scott took a closer look. Full of clumpy powder. Though no doubt that was the rain's doing. Was it feed? No, of course. Whitney's farm was for cotton, not livestock. And then Scott recalled these bags and how he came across them. Fertilizer from Tyler. He used most of the 5 tons given to him out of kindness, but it was useless. A transition product, labelled so on the bags. But then he remembered something, and even the sheer thought made him feel ill. But this thought gave him an insurance policy. And with a heavy heart and a sincere hope it really wouldn't come to this, he lifted the sacks laboriously onto his truck and threw a few jerry cans of diesel fuel around them. Driving slowly, as not to disturb his cargo as the truck rumbled up the dusty, uneven path away from the farm, Scott wondered one final time. Was this the solution? The one arrived at during a stormy night, when his emotions were charged, really right? There was still time. Still a few moments left in which he could turn around and sort it out another way. The clock on the dashboard swept further around. 8:30. Still time, yes. But was Transition and its odious CEO, Ashton Kleinman, really going to magic Brian and Elliot back by Scott's hasty deadline of 9? Could anything really happen in 30 brief fleeting minutes? Unsure, and glancing across, Scott saw the brown envelope, padded by the audio tape within. To delay the inevitable, at the T-junction at the end of the road he took a left toward town, where there was a post office. Trundling slowly along, it took half an hour to simply get there. The truck was so heavily laden with goodies. A present for Transition, to facilitate their transition, Scott reminded himself as he walked up to the counter. The clerk looked at the man before him, shabby, unkempt and unclean. Bathing and personal hygiene were paled into comparison. Actually, not important at all, for there was now no one Scott Whitney cared about seeing him in such a state of dishevelled depression. "Bub, what's happened?" the clerk asked, out of manners to some degree, and out of perverse nosiness to another. Scott looked up and grunted. "Never you mind, bub," the farmer spat back through a brow as furrowed as one of his fields had been back in the good old days. "Send this." The clerk looked down at the brown package Scott presented to him, in muddy, dirty hands that left imprints of moisture and muck on the envelope. The envelope itself was feathered and dog-eared with age, and in black marker pen was an address scrawled on the front. To the nearest newspaper that Scott Whitney could even think of, it mattered not. The tape just needed to be sent to someone. Picking it up with the very tips of his fingers, on the very extreme edges of the paper, partly in exaggerated fear of any nasties, the clerk weighed it to ascertain the price. $2.45. You want a receipt?" Scott found a crumpled $10 note and threw it lazily towards the clerk. "Nah, and you keep the change. I won't be needing it any more." "Fine, sir," the clerk said, putting the money into the register as Scott walked out, the bell above the door chiming with a gentle trill as the door was opened and closed again. And a moment later, the engine of the truck rattled as it turned over, sputtering into some sort of life, and as the cracked tires crunched the gravel, it left only a fleeting cloud of loose dirt in the air. Great, Scott thought. Stuck in traffic leaving the city. Stuck between two sports cars with a truckload of red diesel. He turned the radio knob, looking for something. Anything to drown out the meaningless buzz of the traffic. Engines purring and revving in lanes of gridlocked cars. Like ants, they shuffled forward, asynchronously, but not getting anywhere fast. The speakers, battered and bruised in the doorways of the truck, were tinny and beaten up. The needles surfed through the frequencies, through mindless chatter, talk shows and loud music that did nothing but peak and had the life distorted out of it by the brain-dead stereo, until Scott could not endure. The somewhat silence of the city would be preferable to any of this rubbish, this utter crap. It was the sort of stuff that made him want to kill himself. But soon, the city was finally replaced by something far more familiar. The open road. And in the distance, the looming towers and industrial spires of the transition plant, his sole destination. With a gulp, knowing what was to be realized, Scott depressed the accelerator with his foot, brought the truck up to a cool 50 and pressed onward, as the tree line faded and revealed the great administration building that stood like a guardian, protecting the inner guts of the facility. The guts that had spewed forth venom that had proved nothing but ruinous. The perimeter entrance beckoned, the trident calling him on. "Come on then!" But Scott stopped one last time. Pulling over on the deserted road, there was still one more thing left to do. Hopping down and popping the tailgate of the truck, Scott clambered up into the truck bed. The sacks of fertilizer had shifted somewhat with the twists and turns of driving, but that didn't matter. The jerry cans of diesel too had moved, but again that was irrelevant. Picking one up, Scott unscrewed it, and the stench of petroleum distillate hit him in the face as vapor hissed out. Good was good. Liberally, he tipped the full can all over the sacks of fertilizer until they were sodden. They looked like they'd been drenched in the rain, but the pungent smell gave away otherwise. Jumping down, slamming the tailgate back up, Scott gave a look of resolution as he threw himself into the cab once more and yanked the key so hard it twisted. Hands on Scott's wristwatch ticked slowly around the dirtied face. His eyes scanned it, registering the information. 9:42. Yeah, it was time. The engine was started, and with a stomp on the accelerator, the truck began its final journey past the Trident sign and toward the plant. Roaring forward, the truck bounced down the road, winding along a few hundred feet toward the plant. The tree-lined path soon started to open out to the wide gravel concourse that graced the front of the administration block. Swinging the wheel back and forth, Scott swerved in a sharp S-bend pattern that not only kicked up more dust in his wake, but shook the cans of red diesel. Some of the tops leaked, though those that did had their lids on looser than maybe one would normally have them. The liquid seeped out as the truck took a final plunge. Leaning on the tooter, Scott ducked behind the dashboard and kicked the accelerator into the carpet, jamming it against the extent of its travel, and let go of the wheel. The sky, punctuated with metal spires of the plant, was soon replaced by the shadow of the looming front of the administration building, then the glass facade. And then the glass shattered all around, and Scott was thrown about the cab like a rag doll as the front of the truck slammed into the front of the reception area, reducing the great sheets of glass into a million fragments. The truck windows shattered too as the window frames flailed and lacerated the truck, and even hidden in the footwell, Scott was showered with bits of glass that dug into his back. The truck was still careening across the varnished floor that once before graced rich investors and slick executives, until it struck the reception desk that Scott had been so bluntly treated at. The wood splintered, and a shrill scream started to break through, but it was cut short with a crunch of metal, plastic, and steel as the truck's front end shredded the very fabric of the reception desk. Hitting a great concrete column that was one of the key ceiling supports and reducing the powdery cement to chips on the floor, the truck somersaulted, hit the ceiling with a crashing bang that caved in the cab roof as if it was cardboard. This inversion sent the fuel-soaked fertilizer and diesel caddies flying, and the sacks exploded with mushy clumps of tainted fertilizer, while the cans flew through the air, the loose-lidded ones spraying diesel with casual abandon on ever-wrecked surface, and the tightened ones burst with the impact. Gallons of the old diesel coated everything in the truck's wake, and the front finally came to rest, crumpled against the dented wall that was the rear extremity of the administration block, knocking the transition logo square off and severely damaging the wall itself. Daylight, from behind, penetrated the cracks and crevices with curiosity, eager to spy on the destruction within. Dazed and injured, Scott couldn't move. The chaotic impact had shattered his leg as he crouched in the footwell. His back was studded with glass fragments, and they were bleeding, turning his dirty checkered shirt a bloody crimson. But unable to move, for the shock of coming to rest had forced his head into the jammed accelerator pedal, which had flung back out with the force of a bear trap and had snapped his neck in multiple places. At least now, he couldn't feel the amazing pain the rest of his body was trying to register, and he could just about see an orange glow out of the smashed window, and the smell of burning petroleum distillate, beginning with a smouldering tinge, started permeating his sinuses. Smashed rubble clattered all around. the dust and grime adding to the destruction of the reception area. The receptionist had been reduced to a red veneer on the front of the truck that had now been compacted into the wall. Plumes of smoke rose from the burning fuel and fertilizer, which cracked and popped like firecrackers. The sound drew attention to something that Scott Whitney had totally overlooked. The footlocker in the bed of the truck, against the bent cab partition. It still had a load of old fireworks from Christmas. And with all this flame licking around, the awful inevitability became apparent. "Dad! Dad! Dad! Dad!" Elliot's voice echoed, but it was just an illusion in Scott's head, a hallucination of his son. "Dad! Dad! Son!" Scott tried to say, reaching up, but his shattered body would not allow it. He was trapped in the burning wreckage of his truck. Looking down to the furthest extent his eyes could, he saw a crimson puddle forming under his knee. And then, looking back further, a piece of jagged metal that almost certainly severed his leg clean off, leaving starkly white bone open to the air. Just as well he was paralyzed, the pain would be untenable, and the urge to tear his leg off unstoppable. From the other side of the plant, around a side passage, a buggy rode around on puffy tires, and on it was Ashton Kleinman. Obviously had been on the other side of the plant when the crash took place. His face was ashen as he saw the ruined administration block, black smoke pouring out of the smashed entrance. Everything combustible was igniting and fueling the conflagration. Stepping onto the gravel, he ran in and instinctively up to the window of the truck, through the flames and debris. He saw Scott prone in his metal coffin. "You're a fool to think this was the way, Whitney. Look at what the hell you've done." Scott took a last look at his adversary. "Screw you. Screw the hell you. All right?" Kleinman was going to respond, but Scott lost interest. The hallucinations started again. "Dad! Dad!" Except they weren't pretend. His son Elliot ran over to the smashed van and looked at his dad. "Oh, Dad!" "Elliot," Scott gasped. "What are you doing here? Mr. Kleinman was bringing us to see you." Is your mom there?" Brian's sweet voice filled the chamber, deafening the sound of popping combustibles and crumbling masonry. "I'm here, hon. And what a mess you've made." "I thought you left me." "Almost. Seems Mr. Kleinman had a change of heart." Before she could say any more, a hissing sound emanated from the rear of the truck. The fireworks. "Get out! This thing's gonna blow! No! No!" Brian tried to resist, but Scott was adamant. "Out! Now! Take Ellie!" Brian grabbed her son and made for the gaping hole at the front, where daylight and safety beckoned, and took a step. Crash! A girder fell from the ceiling, as the support that the truck had weakened gave way, and flaming debris blocked their path. Elliot hugged close to his mother. "Don't want to die, Mommy!" "You won't, sweetie. You won't." Suddenly, Kleinman spoke again. "Over here!" Brian and Elliot looked to see the executive, his suit covered in dirt and ash, holding up a flimsy piece of plasterboard that made a rudimentary escape tunnel through the debris. It was on fire and covered in smashed concrete and heavy masonry. "Come on! I can't hold it!" Brian and Elliot scampered through to the other side, their knees and hands grazed and bleeding from the sharp, rough rubble everywhere. Dropping the sheet, Kleinman went over to wrestle with the jammed door of the truck. "What are you doing?" Scott said, hearing the efforts to force the door. "Look, I can't leave you to die. I just can't," Kleinman said through gritted teeth. His conscience had resurfaced at the last possible point. The door just wouldn't budge, and the ceiling collapsed further. "Get my family out," Scott pleaded softly, his blood loss becoming terminal at this point. "They're out," Kleinman said, looking over through the mounting pile of rubble to see Brian and Elliot on the precipice of safety outside, but still very close to the burning office building and joining a great crowd of workers who'd made for the exits and run to help them. Seems it's just you and I, Whitney. Scott was too weak to reply and fell unconscious. Finally, his jacket ripped, shoes ruined, and reputation and plant burned, Kleinman looked into the truck cab once more. His apology would never be complete as the fireworks in the truck ignited, blowing the locker apart, setting off the bags of fertilizer like bombs that ripped the building apart in great erupting fireballs, and worse, sending flaming debris into the main chemical plant, shearing off pipes and allowing unprocessed chemicals into the air. Gas combusted instantly on contact with the red-hot shrapnel and flaming concrete shards, sending the entire plant up in one great boom as the metal structures melted and collapsed, the administration block vaporizing and a great black cloud shooting hundreds of feet into the air, before collapsing itself to dump tons of ash and sediment on the blackened ruins of the plant. And standing there, all alone, were Brian and Elliot, who'd fled back up the road. The 70 workers that stood around this great campfire and observed, perished, burned into the gravel in the intensity of the final blast. And, looking over this devastation, realizing that they were on their own now, tears filled Elliot's eyes, knowing his dad was now no more. His inspiration and world gone in a flash. But a comforting hand found his shoulder as the sound of distant sirens wailed closer. Brian knelt and embraced the little boy. "Everything's gonna be okay, hon." The end. Thank you for listening to this audio reading. For more information on Oranges and Lemons, and to find out about Richard's other writing projects, be sure to check out his blog at www.richardholliday.co.uk, or follow him on Twitter at RJPHoliday. You can also check out Jamie's website for more audio presentations at jamieremmerproductions.com.